Well, I knew my father until I was 7 years old when he died. So my memories are pretty murky, and they're all around the house because he traveled so much in his political organizing career that I can remember his coming in the door. And he always had presents for us, a little something. And it was always something wonderful. And I remember him around the breakfast table. Well, he was from Louisville, Kentucky, an old plantation family. My mother spent the first year of their marriage back there, and she just hated it. The climate was so terrible, it was so humid, it was hot all night, and they never cooled off. And being a Puget Sound girl, she just never got used to it. In the very austere old Southern family life, she couldn't handle it. And my brother then was born there, and so taking care of a little baby with this just terribly conservative, traditional background, she just didn't feel as though she'd ever fit. Made that very clear to my father. He didn't like it either. He didn't especially like being in law practice with his older brother, who was harshly on the opposite side of every political issue. He came out here, and as a Southern Democrat, he looked around and said, "Where are all the Democrats?" Because there weren't any. There were none in the Senate, and the legislature had something like 4. And he couldn't understand it. And so his career then turned to political organizing, and he headed the Democratic Party. And he hung around with people that my mother was not used to at all. He wasn't a drinker or a smoker, which is unusual for politicians, but he hung around with everybody who was in the racetrack with their big cigars and terrible smells, and in the rising of the labor unions in the 20s. My mother had to be photographed, and she had to travel with him on his trips, so it wouldn't look as though he was divorcing. That was very important. But I just remember seeing him around the house because I never was allowed to go anywhere. Sometimes they went on camping trips, and I cried because I was left at home. Sometimes they took my brother and sister, and they went on pack trips up near Copper Notch, around the Glacier Peak, Chelan region. And I was left home in bed just shaking in tears because I wanted to get on a horse in front of my mother and go along. And they didn't believe in taking little children places in those days. So I've probably been making it up for it ever since. Well, my mother was raised here. Her father came out as a lumberman from back east. He had one arm, and he had overcome that handicap. He could cut wood, cast a fly rod. I don't know how he tied his shoes, but he did everything, played golf, championship golf. And my mother learned a lot about overcoming a handicap. Of course, hers was a woman who did not have a college education. But the principle was the same because she was very close to my father, and she learned that you could do anything that you wanted to do. And she pretty much did. After my father died, she pulled herself together, and with no experience in any kind of business, she started a career of her own by getting into my grandfather's business, which was left to her, and went from there to broadcasting after she got rid of a mortgage during the Great Depression. Well, she was a Northwestern girl. She grew up right here on Puget Sound, sailing with her father and on horseback. She spent her childhood on First Hill in the Stimson Green Mansion, owned now by my sister Patsy. And she raised a couple of baby bears there, which she would entertain the neighbors walking down the street, scared a few of them. And she rode her pony all over First Hill where the hospitals are, and belonged to a crowd. Her father took her out sailing on the Olympic, which was a large gaff-rigged yawl with topsails. He had one arm, and they sailed to Princess Louisa all over the San Juans in Canada, and she, as a little girl, was strapped to the mast with a tether so she wouldn't fall over, and she learned to swim when her father dunked her into the water and said, "Swim." And I said, wasn't it terrifying? Because we learned, of course, here on the beach and in swimming pools. And she brought out an Olympic coach to teach us how to swim when we were too old to even remember, too young to even remember. And she said, "No, I wasn't scared. I thought that if my father asked me to do it, there was no reason I couldn't do it." And since he had one arm and he overcame that handicap, played golf, fly casted, he was a lumberman, so of course he could cut wood. He could do everything. And she was very close to him, and she knew that handicaps were for overcoming, and of course hers was being a woman without a college education. She considered that her handicap, but it didn't stand in her way. Well, my father died when I was 7 years old, and he died of a very fast-moving illness, and my mother was devastated. My grandfather, her father, my father, and her brother all died within a couple of years of each other, so here were the three strong men in her life who all died at once, very suddenly. And she couldn't even grieve properly. And of course we couldn't either. We had no help. And she simply buckled down and went to work in the downtown real estate business that her father left to her in his estate. And my father didn't leave her much of a legacy except a political reputation. She went as a delegate to the convention which nominated Franklin Roosevelt. But from then on, she didn't want anything to do with politics. She went to work learning the business, and it was hard. We didn't see much of her. We were raised by housekeepers. We never suffered materially. That period was just following the Depression. When he died, it was 1932. So there was mortgages. People were jumping out of windows and coming up from the railroad tracks to our house for sandwiches. And unemployment was everywhere. People were riding the trains. But we were always well taken care of. There were always housekeepers, people who looked after us, raised a good garden. We had fruit trees and fresh vegetables all the time, and a nice place out in the trees, not far from the sound. Well, she simply buried herself in her business, and several years later, she got out from under this mortgage, paid back the bank, and looked around for something else to do, and that's when she got into broadcasting. Oh, I think she was a role model in a way, because we always felt close to her. I felt very close to her, although I didn't see her very much. And I had a lot of independence, because I learned how to be devious and to avoid the woman who was assigned to take care of me. And I knew where I could go to get back into the woods. I could disappear whenever I chose. And I was good at circumventing the rules. And I guess all three of us learned to be pretty inventive on our own. It was a neighborhood where there were very few kids our age. And actually it was a very isolated neighborhood. And when World War II came along, transportation wasn't easy. So we couldn't get into Seattle and associate with the crowd our age in the school. So we had the water and the trees, and I had a horse, and there was always dogs and cats, and the excitement of animals around. And then there was Copper Notch. We went over there quite often, and I spent a great deal of time there just with my horse up in the hills. Yeah, she was very loving and affectionate. But as we got into our teen years, I think that was hard for her to handle. She sent us all the way to boarding school because she really couldn't deal with teenagers very well. She loved babies, and she read to us a lot. She introduced books to us, movies. The first movie I ever saw in my life, I went with Patsy. We saw Moby Dick. And she read stories to us about the French Revolution and the fall of the Bastille, and all that was mixed in with Winnie the Pooh. And we learned the Marseillaise and God Save the King. She was very much of an Anglophile. And we did a lot of singing. But we didn't spend a whole lot of time together. And she trusted us. She thought we could make our own decisions. And she was very immersed in her own work. I think we thought of her as somebody who was doing something very, very important. And we probably wished that we could do something important in our own lives sometime. But she was quite a shadow to follow. As a teenager, I got very tired of having to live up to her moral standard, because we heard a great deal about that. Honesty and truthfulness, and, keeping yourself clean, dear. And I had a boyfriend who was a lifeguard at the swimming pool, and I learned to be a very good swimmer over a period of a few years, sometimes late at night and early in the morning. And she liked him, but, the boys and men who came and went in the lives of my sister and me were never right for her. And she discouraged me from getting married by saying, well, dear, you do seem a little young for housework and babies and to settle down. And I thought, housework and babies. I guess that is what it means, doesn't it? It wasn't just being in love. She was a mixture of being kind of judgmental and yet always in the end accepting and forgiving. It was very important to her that the three of us stay close together, because after losing my father, she had probably her strongest sense was one of family togetherness. She said, you three, if you just stick together. And I don't know if it was her words, but we always had. I think we wouldn't have anyway. But she was having come through the Depression when everything was falling apart. And she has spent the rest of her life until she died at 97 thinking there was going to be another Great Depression, and that the banks would fail at any moment. She just said, you three stay together, and she quoted the Rothschild family, the old Rothschild who took several sticks and he broke each stick. And he said, this is what happens when you have one stick, you break it real easily. But you put all these sticks together and you can't break it. She told that story again and again. Yeah. I think she would probably like my present Russian husband, because she liked Russians very much, especially handsome ones. But no, the men in our lives were never never measured up. But she was just accepting. Well, when I left college, which was Bennington, before finishing my college education, to marry a medical student from Dartmouth, and we had a short period in the Army of Occupation in Germany, and then came back and lived for 10 years in Boston, and we had 2 children who now each of them have 3 of their own. And then we lived in Florida, and then we split. We divorced in Florida, and I came back to Seattle with the 2 children, and we've been here ever since. Well, I have a son who has 3 children, and my daughter has 3 children, and all of them are 2 years apart. They're like stair steps. And I don't see them often enough because they're real busy in school, and my son's kids are skiing all the time, and they live in the state but not in Seattle, and we go back and forth, and of course I wish they were around the corner, but maybe we can do something about that someday. They're wonderful kids, and they like me. And the younger ones of my daughter, they come to visit sometimes, and they do a lot of traveling. They live in California, and they like me too, so I just have a lot of fun when they come and stay, and they just come blowing through here and stay for a few days and move on. And right now they're in France, trying to learn French.
Do you feel close to Wendy?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Did you always?
Yes. We had rocky times during teen years, but we were never out of touch. And we're a lot alike in some ways.
How do you feel you're like?
Maybe it's a sense of humor. No, she's not like my mother at all. It was a tough period for both of them in the teen years because we went through a difficult period with their father. And a divorce for, 10 and 12-year-old kids, it's tough to keep a good close relationship. I wish I could have handled it better. But I think both of them, as they grew older, realized that parents do the best they can, and no parents are good parents. And we become people instead of the perfection that we hope. And I feel very good when I'm with both of them. Well, she's become a very, very perceptive, sensitive person. Oh yeah, Dorothy thinks that she has the legacy and the mantle, and she carries the name around and sort of speaks for the family, and yet she doesn't realize that Mother worked hard all her life and kept a low profile all her life. She hated to be out in public, and she hated to be photographed because that was a no-no in that culture. And she hated politics, and she never traded on her father's name. She kept her married name.
Interesting, isn't it?
She didn't use Stimson. She was Mrs. Scott Bullitt, who was somebody from away from here.
That is interesting. I hadn't thought about that.
Yeah, she made her own way with her own name.
Yeah.
She worked tirelessly, and she never expected to get something for nothing. Yeah. I think so. think it's hard to raise kids to be able to feel comfortable and use money, which you know they're going to have, and yet to be motivated to work hard and be creative and to be self-sufficient. And I guess you have to expect kids maybe just to understand that or something, because it's kind of a mistake to make kids feel like they're depression kids when they're not. They need to be able to function in a society on a level where they can exert some leadership and be comfortable using money. I don't think Mother ever worked when she was young. I always did.
Yeah.
I couldn't wait. I was so self-conscious at the privilege that we had. I guess we all were. That we got jobs at the earliest opportunity. And learned how to make it.
Yeah.
Past the superiors and the career, workers behind a soda fountain counter or a jewelry counter or something, who said, "How come you're working?" And you have to work twice as hard and come to work early and stay late, and then it takes about 6 weeks to be accepted. But that was kind of tough.
Yeah.
And it's hard sometimes to convince people that there's a need to work that isn't just money. That money is very important, and it's more important to some people than other people, but you can need to work anyway. And with all the work that I've done with volunteers, you find people working just as committed, just as dedicated, just as hard, and just as long hours for no money at all. But the rewards are seeing something happen.